Welcome to the Be Fused podcast. My name is Don, and I'm your host for the Be Fused podcast. And just as we get ready to get started with launching this podcast, we wanted to just spend a little bit of time with Dr. Anthony Marotta and diving a little bit deeper into the topics that we're going to be covering in the podcast, as well as just taking a deeper look at key themes that we're going to cover as well. And so with that, welcome, Dr. Marotta.
Hi, Don. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thanks so much. I appreciate it. And so maybe we start with the idea of why did you want a podcast that was focused around this, and also with that it might be helpful to cover the name of the podcast as well.
Certainly. So be fused, food that you should eat daily. This is very topical for me as a clinical scientist because again, having spent, 25 plus years taking innovations from concept into the clinic, I realized that, and we talk about this in medicine, more preventative modalities. And I think looking at this, food is such a critical facet in everyone's, life, so to speak. And we're starting to see some very intriguing and elegant findings, looking at the interaction of food with obviously the microbiome and then, the impending effect as it relates clinically. And I think one thing that we're seeing, so to speak, as it relates to food is that there's a lot of intriguing findings that have merits. But I think one thing that is a challenge for consumers is where to actually get their information from. And with that, we wanted to launch this podcast as a means of giving consumers a committed and truthful site by which we'll actually look at like the data and relate data to actually clinical outcomes and provide people with more of a trusted resource for clinical and scientific information as it relates to foods.
Yeah, it is so important, especially right now, given everything that's going on, in the epigenetic realm, as well as just in general, looking at diet and the impact of diet. I know I keep seeing article after article online that is communicating something related to you either should eat something or you shouldn't eat something, and I feel like there's a lot of that back and forth as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know what? I think with that, I see it quite prominently on social media where don't eat this, don't eat that. But, for the average consumer, it's like, okay, well, what should I eat? And you see it, for example, with the whole plant-based movement. Does eating a plant-based diet provide benefits? I think the data shows us that migrating or adopting like healthier plant-based options is important. But what's the definition of plant-based, i.e. more whole foods, or again looking at it and looking at processed foods? They're two distinct entities, so to speak. And with that, you can't, just because something's a derivative of a plant, you can't call it plant-based and automatically infer that it's actually better for people.
So can you give me some examples of that? I mean, I just would be interested to know, as we go to dive deeper, will there be clear examples of things that because it's plant-based doesn't necessarily mean it's healthier?
There's I'd actually there's a lot of that. Like again, going to some of the food shows, you actually see like a lot of plant-based propositions. And I don't want to name any company, per se, obviously, because that's not also what we intend to do. But a lot of the early entrants in the space have been, just heavily or ultra processed, products. And with that, again, it doesn't matter if it's just even plant based. All ultra processed food, to a large extent, is laden with chemicals and different derivatives that impact basically people's well being. And we're starting to see more of that as it relates to what it does at the level of the gut. And, we see things like leaky gut on the rise and more awareness on that. But then you also start to see that people are telling consumers, oh, have more probiotics. Well, is that necessarily the right treatment?
Mm.
Or do we want to actually be using more of a prebiotic, strategy, effectively, where we actually feed the gut the right food to propagate like healthier bacteria, as opposed to, for example, just feeding people a bolus of bacteria.
Yeah.
So I think there's, no matter what area or aspect of it that you look at, whether it's like meat based or carnivore based diets, or again, an omnivore herbivore type of diet, there's just foods that, when you look at it, we have to question, should we be feeding this to people? And I think that's part of the aspect of this, or focus of this. What should people be eating, and where should I get my information from? Because there's quite a lot of it that exists out there. And, again, too, I think it has to be more robust and more evidence based.
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, just like with anything with the internet, it's almost like anything that you want to be true, you can make true just based on, searching in the wrong places sometimes. And having trusted sources is so important. And having, this podcast become a part of that would be a phenomenal, place to be as well. Just using, more evidence bases and talking about those as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And, again, too, like, one paper or one patient is not enough data to substantiate, like, or to reach a definitive conclusion, as as a scientist as well. It requires reproduction of the results. And I, basically just see, for example, a lot of inferences being made, leveraging anecdotal information, or the n of one, type of like outcome to, like, direct consumers to affect change. And with that, again, is that the best thing for each individual person? As you know, in medicine, we talk about the right therapy for the right patient at the right time. Every patient is unique. And what will work for one patient or one person may not work for the next person. And I think we have to, we need to teach people that, again, look at where you actually get your information from. And, make sure that if you're going to, like, impose a lifestyle change or try to adopt a lifestyle change, work with the designated, like, healthcare professional to monitor your well-being as well.
Yeah. And why is this such an important topic for you? What is it that makes this topic interesting for you?
Well, again, going back to an earlier comment, I spent 25 plus years on the clinical side. And, growing up, always, appreciating food and being fortunate, to have a family that had their own vegetable patch. And, effectively, a lot of stuff was made like from scratch. For me, food is such a critical component of my existence and, my upbringing, that, again, as I started to, look at things from a healthcare perspective and thinking about preventative modalities, what's one of the things that we can actually impact in a meaningful way with everyone? And, food, people eat 3 to 6 times a day. So if we actually were to give people like better nourishment, what would be the outcomes, like, clinically? Would we wane off, certain diseases? Like, could we reduce the impact or burden of certain diseases? And I think that's why, again, for me, it's tying two fundamental, or fusing, pardon me, two fundamental ideologies together: medicine with food, to create, a fusion of culture and ideology to give people the right tools, i.e., the foods that they should eat daily. So very,
Yeah.
very passionate for me.
Yeah, it's I mean, as we thought about the name, I mean, this idea of fusion kind of, runs throughout the overall theme, right? Both from a healthcare as well as a, food fusion side. Also just, this idea of, making sure that you're eating the right things that support, you as an overall individual is so important as well. There were three things that we talked about covering in the podcast as well. So, sustainability, nutrition, and the intersection of both. Can we just talk a little bit more about those? Individually, what is sustainability in your mind?
So, as it relates to sustainability, it's bigger, obviously, than just the planet. It's also, tied together with economic pressures, and then coupled with that, health outcomes, as well. So, we're really looking at sustainability of the planet as well as all of the inhabitants that exist. And then, there's also the economic, considerations with that. That in order to create a sustainable model where everyone thrives, it needs to be equitable for all stakeholders as part of that. You know,
Yeah,
and
and growing enough food for the population also seems to be a bit of the challenge, right? And what seems to have led us to this point.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and that is obviously again another significant issue because even the other day I was talking to a functional medicine specialist, and again, does everything need to be organic? Like because in that realm we probably cannot feed the entire planet, and they're talking about going the data suggests that we're going to go from what is it I think 7 billion people today to by 2050 we'll be at 10 billion people. So the population is going to grow, by another, let's say 40 odd percent. Well, how are we going to nourish all these people? And so with that, we've already seen the impact on the planet. How do we, effectively change things or do things a little bit differently so that like our species and all the species can thrive, so to speak, within this, within the the planet and the universe. There definitely needs to be some changes that actually occur.
Very good. And then when you think about nutrition and what nutrition will be discussed, here in the podcast, what are your thoughts there?
So I'd say at a high level, looking at nutrition, what is nutrition, what is nutritious food, and then also kind of coupled with that, because again, this is more of like a clinically centric, you know podcast as well. I think by different diseases, we need to start like helping people like understand like, okay, if you have an ailment, what are the diets that are recommended, or arguably what are the foods, because I don't even like the word diets. It's diet has a negative connotation for me, so it's like, what are the foods that you should be eating if you are at risk or predisposed to a condition, or actually like trying to manage your own condition as well. And it's quite interesting because again, looking at like some of the data, let's say in autoimmune conditions, should certain patients who have an underlying autoimmune condition be eating highly processed foods when we know that it may, create a dysbiotic environment, that it might exacerbate leaky gut, and with that, that it could conceivably also trigger, for example, an insult of inflammatory factors that would arguably perpetuate disease. So I think what I'm doing is trying, or what I want to do is make sure that we bring the ideologies together and we give people the right tools to help them manage their lifestyles.
Yeah, it's so important, and I mean, it's interesting whenever I look even at people in my family prior to my parents. My parents have lived a long life, but at the same time, we've had plenty of people that could only live to their 60s and 70s in my family as well. And so, who knows how much of that could have been impacted by a good diet, and then also maintaining good habits as well. And just I think that there's a drastic benefit that could be had, kind of across a lot of different people inside of the discussions that we have as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And eating is, and this will be the topic of one of the other individuals, Arun, that joins us, but like, for him, eating is much more than just, you know, sitting down with a meal in front of you. It's like, okay, what time are you eating? How are you eating? With whom are you eating? Are you eating like in a conscious state where you're perceiving what's going on, or is it a mindless activity, where you're sitting in front of your computer or on your phone or in front of a TV, and you're going through the motions of eating, but you're actually not perceiving it. And I
Yeah.
think that's a big problem in today's society too. Like, we want to capture the moment, so to speak, so you can see people snapping, 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 but you actually don't enjoy the moment. So you lose out on opportunities. And I think we all need to make a better point when you're sitting down, to have a meal. Like, sit down with your family or your friends or whomever or even business colleagues, sit down and actually enjoy it. Have a great conversation, enjoy the food, enjoy the experience.
Yeah, it's
That's missing.
it's one of those things that that it's not just like what you eat or when you're eating. I know my wife really enjoys, cooking as well because it helps to bring people together.
Yep.
And similarly, I kind of look at the idea that, you can't be this in this grab and go kind of culture. Um, and sort of pushing your personal relationships aside. It's one of the reasons why I like podcasting. It's one of the reasons that, I enjoy these interviews, because I think, it's a lot of fun for me to kind of dig deeper and deeper into the subjects that people have, and ask more questions, and hopefully make the conversation more engaging as well. But for me personally, it's, just that interconnectedness that's important. And I'm not even eating any food at this point in time, but I do have my coffee here. So
Yeah, yeah. And I have my water. Yeah. Important to have the water with you, or the coffee.
that's right. That's right. Very good. And so, I mean, as we think about the different topics that are coming, there's so much to learn about these different topics. Can you talk a little bit about peckish? And you were recently selected by the NAC UFS as well, and to write an article. So, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, certainly. So we'll go into peckish. So peckish, was our first foray in terms of trying to give consumers access to better better quality grab and go products. That proposition, or that endeavor, started, around 7 years ago, where we were actually looking to change, the whole grab and go environment. So freshly made, like, sandwiches, salads, wraps, baguettes, and with that, again, a real hard focus, or hard line focus, on ingredient selections. And it's definitely been a challenge to identify ingredients more often than not. And this is one of the things that consumers don't understand, or even partners don't understand, with peckish. They'll come to us and ask us to create an offering, for them, but what they don't realize is that that'll take us, per product, typically on average between, let's say, 3 to 9 months, effectively, to produce a product. Because if it's something that we can, where we've qualified ingredients, it's already easier to do it. But if it's something where we have to, like, qualify new ingredients, then that's where, again, it takes some time to effectively reduce things into practice. It's almost like, again, we're developing a pharmaceutical, where, we want that food to be of nutritive value. We want it to be as minimally processed as possible. We want to make sure that it, like, arguably has good macro, micro, nutrient profiles, that, again, it's not laden with, like, saturated fats, sugars, and, obviously, that we're using good quality, proteins, as an example. So within the North American marketplace for ham and bacon, I've only actually been able to find one manufacturer that makes ham to our specifications, and only two manufacturers that actually, like, make bacon. And of their entire catalog of bacon, there was only one product of bacon that actually worked for us. Because, again, they're just, they're just, the products that are out there today, there's probably far more chemicals than actual, like, food ingredients.
Wow.
and that's a big problem.
Wow. It does sound like a big problem. And, you know, I guess the one question that might come up in people's minds as they listen to this is where would they find peckish foods? How would, you know, where would it be available?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. So again, right now, peckish is predominantly, in the Lower Mainland in British Columbia. Our plan is to roll that out more aggressively. So we're taking a bit of a unique approach, to making it more broadly accessible, where we're actually going to partner with food manufacturers or other food brands that have a grab and go repertoire, because there's a lot of co-packers that exist, effectively both within Canada and the United States. And so what our plan to do there is to actually, because we control the ingredients, right? And we know what we want to use and what we don't want to use. We'll actually roll these recipes out to other manufacturers where they would actually follow our, standard operating procedures, and they'd actually be able to produce, a peckish offering for their community. Because again, too, and going back to the sustainability piece, regionalization of food supply is actually a critical thing. you know, you know, to really try to minimize impact, again, let's make it more local. Let's make it more regional. It not only supports the communities that we're going in with, but it supports the food ecosystems that exist within those geographies as well.
Yeah.
And I think that's a critical thing too, with it, where again, regionalization, they talk about it in the 100-mile diet, but regionalization, you're getting plants, you're getting fruits and vegetables where they're picked, more like kind of where they're ripe or mature to be, harvested, so to speak, as opposed to immature. And I think those also have tangible benefits too, because they can be fully nutrified, before they're harvested, so to speak, as opposed to picking them immature.
Yeah. Yeah, and so critical, you know, overall. So the second part of that was that that you just recently, you know, worked on an article as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about the article and what's discussed in that?
Yeah, that's a sustainability piece that'll like go out, effectively in November. And so again, just kind of high level, that speaks about sustainability and culinary medicine and how they intersect, together. And so what's covered in there is obviously certain aspects of sustainability, but then I've gone into detail also too, looking at like, the impact of ultra processed food, for example, on the microbiome, and what we're seeing, where again it's creating diversity, within the microbiome. And it's predominantly all like, the one category that I picked was emulsification agents. And regardless of the emulsification agent, they all effectively impact the microbiome. They change the diversity in the gut. And again, we know that, like, obviously, diversity in the gut is a good thing when it's the right diversity, but when it's a dysbiotic environment, that's not necessarily a good thing. And you're seeing that, again, with, these class of chemicals, they're disrupting the gut.
So do you think that as a part of the topics that that we have, that we would also talk about not just the food, but also, you know, what are people doing to try and understand what's happening more in the gut as well?
Yeah, I imagine that the plan will be to look at food, but also the impact on the organ systems as well. So the gut, the liver, the critical organs. Like, and when you actually look at it, like looking at the gut and the liver, you know, again, and especially like the gut brain axis, we're seeing that like gut health impacts neurologic, state as well.
Yeah, it's funny that you
So
say that because it's one of my sort of pet peeves, right? And one of the things that I very closely on days like this, whenever I have a lot going on, I very closely sort of monitor my diet because I try and make sure that I don't eat things that are either very heavy in carbs or too sweet because I know that those things make me sleepy. And as I
yeah,
said, I have my coffee here, but the reality is I'm sipping just a very little bit of coffee or caffeine in the afternoon, and there's not much else. I don't really feel tired or anything like that, but I routinely feel like I'm very controlled by my diet. So I will
Yeah.
be very engaged in these conversations as well, just on a strictly personal nature.
Yeah. You know what? Again, too, the conscious realm of eating, right? So, with that, we all try to, effectively control consumption of things, because we've been led to believe that, certain things are potentially like terrible for you. But again, like what's the right amount of carb to consume?
Right.
When should you consume carb? Right? Like, should you be eating like, red meat, like effectively? And if you do, how much red meat should you eat, like, per week, so to speak? And like deli meats, everything is in fine balance, right? So, again, and when you layer on like a clinical condition, that's when it needs to become a little bit more prescriptive as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and to that point, right? I mean, I've done my fair share of developing diagnostics as well. And I mean, to, the extreme, you see cancer in everybody. I mean,
Yeah.
these cancer cells are there. They're able to be activated pretty much in all of us. The reality is only certain people though get sick. And
Yep.
the reason why they get sick, still isn't vastly known in our
No.
world. And so, to me, this is kind of, one of those steps that we have to go through to better understand, that is to really understand people's diet and, what is going on, inside of us a little bit more with the things that we're eating as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I think going to that, like it's stress, whether it's psychological stress or like stress because the food that we're eating is not as clean as it should be. Like they're just, they're just stressors. They put stressors on our systems, and with stress, obviously it manifests into different diseases, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dr. Marotta, thank you so much for sharing with us, what your thoughts in terms of what we're going to cover in the Be Fused podcast. I definitely am excited by the topics that we're going to get to cover, and the guests that we're going to get to have in the future. And hopefully this is an exciting moment for other people as they listen to the first podcast. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for your time and for being such a great host.